Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and this was meant to be Friday's video, but yeah, we are back with more the executive branch or White House for the United States government. Um, I think we're on the Madison presidency. Yeah, Madison. Today we'll be looking at the secretaries of state because there were 4 in total. But before we do that, do want to go ahead and remind you I've got 2 ways to donate to the channel if you are so inclined. I have a Patreon account, which is a monthly, month-to-month donation system. And I have a Coffee account, which can do much the same, but also allows you to do single one-time donations. I'll be putting both both of them in the description box below the video as usual. If you are in financial trouble or donating will put you in financial trouble, please don't donate. I'd rather you take care of what you need to take care of. It's hard enough out there with the idiots in charge. If you can donate and you want to donate, thank you. I do appreciate it. I really, really do. Now, what was I going to say? I do this on my own, me, myself, and I. So yeah. I do no commercials. And that's just out of a personal principle of my own. And I'm not getting paid by any of the social media websites as of yet. That said, let's go ahead and now jump into what the videos are about. As I said, today we are doing the secretaries of the Treasury. So yeah, and starting out, there they are, Secretary of Treasury. Like I said, 4 of them all together. This first one, 1809 to 1814, so he was there for the first term of Madison. And that is Albert Gallatin. This is from bioguide.congress.gov. He was from Pennsylvania, but was born in Geneva, Switzerland, January 29th, 1761. I was about to say 1961. 1761. Graduated from the University of Geneva in 1779. Immigrated to the U.S. and settled in Boston, Massachusetts in 1780, serving in the Revolutionary War. Was an instructor of French in Harvard University in 1782. Would move to Virginia in 1785 and settle in Fayette County, now part of Pennsylvania. His estate becoming a portion of Pennsylvania, he was made a member of the Pennsylvania Constitutional Convention in 1789. He would then be a member of the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives from 1790 to 1792, be elected to the United States Senate, and take the oath of office on December 2nd, 1793. But a petition filed with the Senate on the same date alleged that he failed to satisfy the constitutional citizenship requirement. And on February 28, 1794, the Senate determined that he did not meet the citizenship requirement and declared his election void. He would then be elected as a Democratic Republican to the 4th, 5th, and 6th Congress, probably back in the House of Representatives, serving 1795 to 1801. Was not a candidate for renomination in 1800, but appointed Secretary of the Treasury by President Thomas Jefferson in 1801, would be reappointed by President James Madison, and served from 1801 to 1814. So, yeah, Gallatin was at the very end of Jefferson's presidency and would be part of Madison's presidency for at least the first term. No, he was earlier for Jefferson. Lord goodness, 1801 to 1814 altogether as Secretary of Treasury. But we know it was only like the first term of Madison, but served for a good portion of Jefferson. Would be appointed one of the commissioners to renegotiate the Treaty of Ghent. In 1814, one of the commissioners who negotiated a commercial convention with Great Britain in 1816 was appointed the United States Envoy Extraordinaire and Minister Plenipotentiary to France by President Madison, 1815 to 1823. Was the Minister Plenipotentiary to Great Britain, 1826 to 1827. Returned to New York City and became president of the National Bank of New York. Died in Astoria, New York on August 12th, 1849. And would be interred in the Nicholas Vault at Trinity Churchyard in New York City. So yeah, that's from bioguide.congress.gov, where he was an early member of Congress. We've also got this from the U.S. Department of Treasury about Gallatin. Born to an aristocratic Swiss family, he immigrated from Switzerland to America in 1780. Was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1795, serving until 1801, though he fought constantly with the independent-minded first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. He was responsible for the law of 1801 requiring an annual report by the Secretary of the Treasury, and he submitted the first 1 year later as Secretary of Treasury. He also helped create the powerful House Ways and Means Committee to assure that Treasury's accountability to Congress by reviewing the department's annual report concerning revenues, debts, loans, and expenditures. Appointed Secretary of the Treasury in 1801 by President Jefferson and by continuing under President James Madison until 1814, he was in office nearly 13 years, the longest term of any secretary in the department's history. As secretary, he followed a Hamiltonian course, establishing the independence of the Secretary of the Treasury and institutionalizing the department's structures. He considerably reduced the federal debt by setting aside revenue for that purpose and revived internal taxes to pay for the War of 1812, but they were not sufficient, and having failed to convince Congress to charter the first bank in the U.S. in 1811, and foreseeing financial disaster, he resigned in 1814. That year, he went to Russia to represent the U.S. in the peace conference with England and France settling hostilities. The outcome of the conference was the Treaty of Ghent, signed in 1814. So yeah, which of course we're looking at the War of 1812, because remember, it's under Madison that the War of 1812 happens and the U.S. gets its butt kicked. Now let's look at Britannica here. He was the fourth U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, 1801 to 1814. 13 long years, so very influential on the Treasury. He insisted upon the continuity of sound governmental fiscal policies when the Jeffersonian Party, then known as the Republican Party, assumed that national political power and was instrumental in negotiating an end to the War of 1812. He plunged into business and public life after immigrating to the New World at the age of 19, settling in Pennsylvania, though it was then known as part of Virginia, and became a mainstay of the Anti-Federalist and later the Jeffersonian Republicans in that area, and in 1795 was elected to the House of Representatives. There he inaugurated the House Committee on Finance, which later grew into the powerful Ways and Means Committee. So we can see his impact to this day. In 1797 to 98, he helped to reduce Federalist-sponsored expenditures aimed at promoting hostilities with France, was bitterly denounced by Federalists in Congress, and when the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed in 1798, Jefferson believed they were partly intended to drive Gallatin, who remember is Swiss, from office. As Secretary of the Treasury, Gallatin stressed simplicity in government and termination of the public debt. Despite heavy naval expenditures and the $15 million Louisiana Purchase in 1803, he managed to reduce the public debt by $23 million in 8 years. So even with one of the most expensive purchases of the day, he still was able to drive down American debt. The declaration of war with Great Britain in 1812 shattered all of Gallatin's most cherished schemes, for he felt war to be fatal to the nation's prosperity and progress. He therefore put the nation's finances in the best order he could and set himself to attain an early peace. Grasping at Russia's proffered mediation of the war, he sailed for Europe in May 1813. Refusing to deal through Russia, Great Britain expressed its willingness to proceed with direct negotiations, and commissioners from the two countries finally met at Ghent in August of 1814. In the tedious discussions that followed, Gallatin played a leading role preserving peace among his colleagues and establishing an enviable reputation as a diplomat. He signed the Treaty of Ghent on December the 24th, helping bring peace. While still in Europe, he was appointed minister to France, serving 1816 to 1823, after which he returned to the United States only to be embroiled in a bitter inter-party political struggle. After serving briefly as minister to Great Britain in 1826 to 1827, he retired from public life and became the National, later the Gallatin Bank, president of that bank in New York City from 1831 to 1839. He was a student of the native tribes in North America and founded the American Ethnological Society of New York in 1842, and was sometimes called the father of American ethnology. But yeah, Albert Gallatin, the first Madison Secretary of the Treasury, though he also served under Jefferson. So yeah. Next, we have a look at George W. Campbell. But as you can see, he serves only so long, because Gallatin leaves in 1814 and Dallas, the successor of Campbell, who succeeded Gallatin, started in 1814. So yeah, George W. Campbell, a very short time in office. From the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Born in Scotland, George W. Campbell, 1769 to 1848, moved with his family to North Carolina in 1772. When President Madison appointed him Secretary of the Treasury in 1814, he became the first cabinet member from a region west of the Appalachian Mountains. He entered office during the War of 1812, and the state of Napoleon's finances was in the nation's finances was in serious disorder. I don't know why I'm misreading everything here. Business had failed to recharter the first bank. Congress had failed to recharter the first bank of the U.S. after its charter expired in 1811, and was not made appropriations to finance the War of 1812. His most perplexing problem was convincing the American people to buy government bonds to pay for the war. Much of the nation's money was concentrated in New England. Your northern states, like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, a lot of your news, New York, New Jersey, um, New Hampshire, that area, which was opposed to the war, and though he put up bonds for sale and begged northern bankers to subscribe, he could not inspire their confidence and was forced to meet the lenders' terms, selling government bonds at exorbitant interest rates. In September of 1814, the British occupied Washington, and the credit of the government was lowered even further. Campbell was unsuccessful in his efforts to raise money through additional bond sales and resigned that October after only 8 months in office, disillusioned and in bad health. So, like I said, that was from the Department of Treasury itself. From University of Virginia's Miller Center, George W. Campbell. He was born in Sutherlandshire, Scotland on January 9th, 1769, and came to the U.S. with his family in 1772. He graduated from the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University, in 1794, and after passing the bar, he opened a law practice in Knoxville, Tennessee. He began his political career as a representative for Tennessee in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1803 to 1809, serving additionally as chairman of the Committee of Ways and Means upon his final term. Upon returning to Tennessee in 1809, he made use of his law education to serve as a judge on the Tennessee Supreme Court of Errors and Appeals until 1811. He returned to legislative duty in 1811 as a U.S. Senator, serving until 1814. Then President James Madison in 1814 appointed Campbell Secretary of the Treasury. He had a short and stormy tenure. When he took office, the nation's finances were in disarray because the charter of the First Bank of the United States had expired and funds had not been appropriated for the War of 1812. He needed to sell government bonds to raise money for the war effort, but had a hard time generating enthusiasm for the program. He resigned after only 7 months in office because of poor health, and returned to the Senate in 1815, and remained there through 1818, serving as chairman of the Committee on Finance. After resigning from Congress, I lost my place. After resigning from Congress, he accepted an offer from Madison in 1818 to become the U.S. Minister to Russia. After 3 of his children died in Russia from typhus, he was allowed to resign in 1820 and return to the U.S. After returning from Russia, he retired from politics permanently, with the exception of 5 years on the French Spoliation Claims Commission, 1831 to 1835. In 1835, he resumed his law practice he had given up in 1802 before joining Congress, a practice he continued until his death on February 17, 1848, in Nashville, Tennessee. So started his time as a lawyer in Tennessee, in Knoxville, and ended in Nashville. But yeah, George W. Campbell. So Campbell's there for only 7 to 8 months. With that, he's followed by Alexander J. Dallas. Boom. And we have, here's from the U.S. Department of Treasury on Dallas, serving 1814 through 1816. When Alexander Dallas, 1759 to 1817, was appointed Secretary of the Treasury by President Madison in 1814, he was faced with a bankrupt Treasury depleted by the War of 1812 and an unstable currency situation caused by the proliferation of commercial banks and their worthless banknotes not backed by specie. Now remember, Campbell came in. The First National Bank charter was already expired, so there was no funding for the War of 1812, and to pay for it, he had to do bonds, something he was having a lot of trouble getting done. So, yeah. From going from Gallatin, where the Treasury was great, and then the sudden number of unforeseen instances, suddenly the nation's finances are in a horrid place. In a report to Congress in 1814, Dallas advocated permanent annual revenue to be raised by internal taxes in addition to the external revenue already derived from customs duties. Remember, the thought of internal taxes were seen as tyranny by most Americans. We had just fought a war. And one of the reasons was unfair taxation, as it was seen, because they had no representation to be taxed. And yet they were taxed so Britain could pay for its own stuff, its own things, like its own wars and everything. And the U.S. is like, hold on. So we have to foot the bill for what you've done over there across the sea. So yeah, taxes internally were not liked. Customs duties were one of the normal ways to raise money. And like we've already talked about, war bonds is another. We had a First National Bank of the United States to help supply financial stability, but its charter was allowed to go. So, Dallas advises the creation of the second bank of the U.S. to supply financial resources to an embarrassed Treasury and regulate banknote circulation. The revenue measures elaborated in this report marked the beginning of a conflict when advocates of internal revenue and those of solely external revenue. This conflict continued until the imposition of the income tax in 1913. So it would take until 1913 before income tax was a regular, normal thing. It was law. Because we kept having issues otherwise. Excise taxes, established in 1813 as a temporary wartime measure, continued to be collected until 1817. Congress enacted a high external tariff in 1816 to help pay the war debt. Dallas succeeded in his efforts to establish the second bank of the U.S., which was chartered by Congress in 1816. And he would retire that year after the new bank had been organized. So, yeah, gets the second bank of the U.S. in place and was one of the advocates for an internal form of taxation. Now, this is from Britannica. Or I think it is. But I don't see anything on Alexander J. Dallas. I don't want to know about his son. Well, I guess that's all I have on Alexander J. Dallas. I also have the Wikipedia article pulled up as normal, but yeah. Born June 21st, 1759 in Kingston, Jamaica, and died January 16th, 1817 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Was married in 1780 and had a kid and had a degree from the University of Edinburgh. Because I believe his family was originally Scottish, even though he was born in Jamaica. Though I may be completely wrong, yeah, when he was 5, family moved to Edinburgh. And then to London. They would 1780 he married his wife, who was Pennsylvania, and part of she came from a family lineage with prominent connections to the British military as the daughter of Major George Smith of the British Army and Arabella Barlow, and a great-granddaughter of Sir Nicholas Trevanion by way of Reverend William Barlow and Arabella Trevanion. In 1781, they would move to Jamaica, and Alexander would be admitted to the bar thanks to his father's connections. But they would move back to Philadelphia in 1783. Admitted back to the Pennsylvania bar in 1785. He was apparently a court reporter, publishing the second set of the state court reports. Ephraim Kirby was the first with the Connecticut reports, but Dallas's were entitled Reports of Cases Ruled and Adjudged in the Courts of Pennsylvania Before and Since the Revolution in 1790, and contained cases from 1754 to 1789. He was then published 3 following volumes under the title Reports of Cases Ruled and Adjudged in the Several Courts of the U.S. and of Pennsylvania, held at the seat of the federal government, 1797, 1799, and 1806. So bringing forth a lot of court rulings and how they came upon the rulings, especially in the early days. Though they were unofficial because he carried out his work publishing the official U.S. reports volumes from his own funds. The first Supreme Court case reported was West versus Barnes in 1791, and it was shortened so that it did not include the full seriatim opinions of the justices. The volumes of reports, of which he produced only 4, were faulted for being incomplete, inaccurate, and extremely tardy. The landmark ruling of Chisholm v. Georgia, which helped prompt the 11th Amendment, was not reported by Dallas until 5 years later, well after the amendment had been ratified. Later he wrote, "I have found such miserable encouragement for my reports that I have determined to call them all in and devote them to the rats in the State House." But his publications still serve as an important legal milestone in American legal publishing, and was a founder of the Democratic Republican Societies in 1793. He would be Secretary of the Commonwealth. Remember, he lived in Pennsylvania. And would function as de facto governor for much of the late 1790s, since the actual governor, Thomas Mifflin, was a bit of an alcoholic. He would be U.S. Attorney and Secretary of the Treasury. So U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania until 1814. His friend Albert Gallatin was Treasury Secretary when the War of 1812 began, and Dallas helped Gallatin obtain funds to fight Britain. The war nearly bankrupted the federal government by the time Dallas replaced Gallatin as Treasury Secretary, with Campbell kind of in between, we already talked about. Dallas reorganized the Treasury Department, brought the government budget back into surplus, championed the creation of the Second Bank of the United States, and put the nation back on the specie system based on gold and silver. He would also serve as the acting Secretary of War and acting Secretary of State. War and State? Dallas, I don't see him listed in State or in War here. So it was just a very short term, March 2nd, 1815 to August 1st. And for a time was also acting Secretary of State. Interesting. Dallas County, Alabama, and Dallas Township, Pennsylvania are named for him. There are 6 U.S. Coast Guard cutters that have been named Dallas, the most recent being the United States Coast Guard cutter Dallas. There is a Fort Dallas in Florida, and the U.S. Navy ship USS Dallas were named after his son, Alexander J. Dallas, who died during his Navy service. His other son, George Mifflin Dallas, was vice president under President James K. Polk and one possible namesake for Dallas, Texas. His father and brother were other possible namesakes of the city. So, yeah. But Alexander J. Dallas. Let's see. So, with that leaves us the last member of the Secretary of Treasury Club, William H. Crawford. So, with that, let's hop over to the bioguide.congress.gov. Was a senator from Georgia. Was born in Nelson County, Virginia on February the 24th, 1772, moved with his father to Edgefield District, South Carolina in 1779, and to Columbia County, Georgia in 1783. Pursued classical studies in a private school and in Richmond Academy in Augusta, Georgia. Studied law, admitted to the bar, and commenced practice in Lexington, Georgia in 1799. Was appointed to prepare a digest of the laws of Georgia in 1799. Member of the State House of Representatives 1803 to 1807, before being elected to the United States Senate to fill the vacancy caused by the death of Abraham Baldwin, and served from November 7th, 1807 to March 23rd, 1813. When he resigned, he served as the President pro tempore of the Senate during the 12th Congress, declined appointment as Secretary of War under President James Madison in 1813, was Minister of France from 1813 to 1815. Returned home to act as an agent for the sale of the land donated by Congress to Lafayette. Appointed Secretary of War by President Madison in August of 1815, but transferred to the Treasury in October of 1816 and served under Presidents Madison and Monroe until 1825. Would make a run for president unsuccessfully in 1824, and due to the illness, he refused the tender of President John Quincy Adams that he remain Secretary of the Treasury, returned to Georgia, and was appointed judge to the Northern Circuit Court in 1827, which he held until his death in Oglethorpe County, Georgia, on September the 15th, 1834, being interred on his estate, Woodlawn, near Crawford, Georgia. So, yeah. So he actually started as Secretary of War, but was transferred to the Treasury. So Secretary of War, Crawford. Yep, there he is. Only serving a short time and coming back to be Secretary of Treasury. Interesting. From the U.S. Department of Treasury. In the Senate, he served from 1807 to 1813. Crawford would distinguish himself as an advocate of conservative public finance, promoting an extension of the charter of the First Bank of the United States in 1811. Madison appointed him Secretary of Treasury as the second Bank of the United States was established thanks to Dallas, and he continued under President James Monroe. He took over a department still in fiscal confusion resulting from the poorly financed War of 1812. With the goal of organizing the nation's bookkeeping, he initiated the Reform Bill of 1817, which charged with the Treasury Department with the responsibility for setting the financial accounts of all the federal departments. The structure of the Treasury Department was subsequently altered to accommodate its increased duties. During his secretary tenure, he oversaw extensive improvement to the nation's infrastructure, including the initiation of coastal fortifications and construction of the great westward leading Cumberland Road. In 1825, he refused President John Quincy Adams' offer to continue as secretary, citing important differences in their views, and resigned at the end of Monroe's term. So, yeah. And finally, we have from Britannica. William H. Crawford, born February 24th, 1772, in Amherst County, Virginia, dying September 15th, 1834, in Elberton, Georgia, was an American political leader of the early U.S. Republic, finished third in electoral votes in the four-candidate race for the president in 1824. After living in Virginia and South Carolina, the Crawford family moved to Georgia, where William attended Moses Waddell's Carmel Academy and was taught school in Augusta, studied law, and in 1799 opened a law practice in Lexington, Georgia. As a Jeffersonian Republican, he entered elective politics in 1803, winning a seat in the Georgia state legislature. In 1807, he was sent to Washington to fill the expired term of Georgia's deceased U.S. Senator, Abraham Baldwin. In the Senate, he quickly earned a reputation for wisdom and sound judgment, and the Georgia legislature elected him to a full term as senator in 1811. He backed U.S. preparations for the declaration of war against Britain in 1812, unlike most Democratic Republicans, and favored a tariff and extension of the charter of the Bank of the United States. But as we know, that would not happen. When Vice President George Clinton died in 1812, Crawford was elected President pro tempore of the Senate, which his predecessor Baldwin had been, but left the position the following year to become Minister of France. In 1815, President Madison appointed Crawford Secretary of War, and then a year later moved him over to become Secretary of the Treasury, a position in which, from 1816 to 1825, his abilities were best utilized. He was a leading candidate for presidential nomination in 1816, but deferred to James Monroe, who would be elected and who retained Crawford as Secretary of the Treasury. Monroe was reelected virtually without opposition in 1824. In 1820. In 1824, Crawford was again a presidential prospect along with John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. The famous corrupt bargain election, where supposedly Clay purposely dropped out to get so his votes would go to Quincy Adams and beat out Jackson. That was what Jackson called the corrupt bargain. But it's not what we're here to talk about today. Crawford won the vote of the party caucus, but by 1824 the caucus system had fallen into disrepute, and its choice proved meaningless. At the time of the election, Crawford was paralyzed and nearly blind as the result of a stroke. Although his supporters claimed that he was steadily improving, he finished a distant third behind Adams and Jackson. Crawford refused Adams' invitation to stay on as Secretary of the Treasury and instead returned to Georgia, where he served as a judge until his death. So yeah, William H. Crawford. But that gives us a good look at all the members of the Secretary of State of the Department of Treasury. The Secretaries of Treasury. I just called them State a moment ago. The Secretaries of Treasury for the Department of Treasury. Seeing the U.S. through one of its more difficult times. We were a young nation, and we had finally pissed off Britain enough that they came back and gave us a butt kicking. Anyone who tells you we won the War of 1812's lying. We roundly got our butts kicked. However, it was a good first test to try to get the nation to come together, which at that point had just been a collection of states. Because remember, up until the Civil War, we cared more about the states than the federal government. But yeah. But in the next episode, we'll go after the Department of War and the Secretaries of War. So yeah. But with that, we'll go ahead and end this episode there. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources, and it can't be a bunch of tinfoil hat wearing sources or anecdotes slapped together to try to make sources. Like the actual mechanic knows of a teacher who taught him how to see through the elemental table at elements not yet known. I don't know. I'm making this shit up, as tends to be the case with anecdotes. But yeah, no, you didn't. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.